Would you mind sharing that experience with the audience?
Yeah, the first time I smoked DMT, it was at a retreat center, and there were a lot of psychedelic literatis and gliteratis, including Terrence. This was 1986, I think. My eyes were closed. It was a dimly lit room in the first place. Yeah, and I beheld this waterfall of flaming color, like Niagara Falls, but made out of like Candyland kind of colors, but flaming, like really bright. And out of the waterfall emerged about a half a dozen ETs. They were about 4 feet tall, and they looked at me very directly. They must have been maybe, I don't know, 50 yards away, 25, 50 yards away. And they just were repeating telepathically over and over. Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see? And if one could be slack-jawed in that state, I was slack-jawed, completely surprised.
Dr. Rick Strassman is a leading psychiatrist and researcher known for his pioneering studies in psychedelics, particularly N N-Dimethyltryptamine. His book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, is a groundbreaking account of his 1990s clinical research, when he gave 60 participants over 400 doses of DMT. We begin our discussion with his 2014 book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, a new science of spiritual revelation in the Hebrew Bible. We then discuss DMT more broadly. Chapters with timestamps are broken out below. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Dr. Strassman, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thanks, Carlos.
Yes, it's such a pleasure to have you on. And today we'll be primarily discussing your book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, which I've recently finished, and it's a wonderful book. Can you provide the audience with a high-level summary of this text?
Sure. Well, it's a follow-up to the original book I wrote about my DMT research in the 90s, which is DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And
it's fun, yeah.
In that book, I describe our DMT and psilocybin research that occurred at the University of New Mexico in the 90s, which was the first new American study with these compounds in humans in a generation. I had a number of questions that I brought to bear on that original research, some of which were spiritual, which involved the platform I was most used to at the time, which was a long-standing practice and study of Zen Buddhism. My interest in DMT as an endogenous or naturally produced psychedelic was to see whether or not giving it replicated features of non-drug religious experience. And my model for religious experience at the time was the Zen Buddhist, which is Satori or Kensho, which is an egoless state. There's no self, there's no object, no subject, no perception, no thoughts, just the merging with the ground of being, so to speak. And most of my volunteers expected that kind of experience as well. They were practitioners of Eastern religious meditation techniques. But in over 50 volunteers, only one of the subjects had that kind of ego-free, self-dissolving kind of state. All the rest, in response to the big dose of DMT, found themselves in a world that was full of content, where their personality, their sense of self was maintained, maybe even stronger than usual. Time and space continued to exist, albeit in a highly altered manner. But there was no like the end of time and space, which occurs in a Buddhist enlightenment type of experience. The content was quite personal. There are objects, beings, angelic or alien kinds of beings, even plants and bees or insects with which the volunteers interacted. So there was give and take, there was communication, all kinds of content, which was not either what I expected or what the volunteers expected. So after finishing the study in 1995, I went back to the drawing board from the spiritual platform anyway. It's interesting. I had been studying with this Buddhist organization since I was 22, and I wrapped up my studies when I was 33. And all during that, uh, you know, well, so all during, no, I wrapped up the studies when I was 43.
Yeah, I was
Um,
going to say, I thought it was 20 years.
yeah, I was 43. Yeah, so I had been studying under their supervision, for over 2 decades.
Mm,
And in the meantime, they were very interested in my interest in psychedelics. Most of the monks, that I knew at the early stage of the organization, got their first, glimpse of the potential of an enlightened life on psychedelics.
mhm,
So they were encouraging me to, look into the relationship between the psychedelic state and Buddhist practice, Buddhist enlightenment. But once, the rubber hit the road and I actually, started doing, studies and giving people drugs and, discussing the potential synergy between, psychedelics and Buddhism, uh, the the it became just a little too close for comfort, for the increasingly rigidified, hierarchy at the monastery.
sure.
And we ultimately, parted ways over, the
Mm,
issue.
mm,
Um, the silver lining was that it freed me up to begin, looking at my own Jewish roots again, and the spiritual, qualities of Judaism, the spiritual, characteristics of the religious, state within the biblical Jewish tradition. So I, began reading the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, and was was really struck by the overlap between descriptions of prophetic experience and the DMT state. There's a lot more similarities between it and the DMT effect than the DMT effect and the formless enlightenment state.
mhm,
So I decided to do a very careful comparison of the two sets of experiences. And when I speak about the prophetic state in the Hebrew Bible, it isn't only foretelling,
right.
predicting or foretelling, as a definition of prophecy is an artifact of translation. The Greek word for a Hebrew prophet is prophetes, which means to see ahead, which is to foretell or to predict.
Yeah.
And that is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word navi, which means to interpret or to be a spokesperson or
Mm,
to be a conduit. It also could be translated as to bubble up. So
mm,
it's a lot more generic than
right.
solely foretelling.
Mm,
So I defined prophecy in a very in a very generic manner, as including any altered state that was underwent by anyone in the Hebrew Bible. So it could be Hagar, the Egyptian mistress, or could be
right.
Moses on Sinai, or
Mm,
it could be David being inspired to write poetry.
mm,
So any contact with angels, any inspiration, any unusual insights, clearly speaking with God or angels would count. But your prediction is just one of many
right.
possible components of the prophetic experience.
Mm,
So after a very painstaking comparison, I learned biblical Hebrew. I read the Hebrew Bible, all 24 books, 3 times. The
mhm,
Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, 10, 15 times. So I looked for every possible description of an altered state in the text, and
yeah.
concluded that they're very similar experiences phenomenologically, the same voices and visions and extreme emotions and physical sensations, out of body experiences, those kinds of
Mm,
things. And so I postulated, that perhaps, naturally occurring DMT in the prophet's brain at the time, mediated um, the phenomenology anyway of the visions. Not the content
Right.
or the information, but the specific form that the visions took.
Hmm.
And so that would then lead to where or what might stimulate those visions, the rise of endogenous DMT, what kind of information, content is contained in the visions, how do you understand it, communicate it, integrate it. Um, yeah, and and also, or another interesting aspect of my study of the Hebrew Bible
Hmm.
was how it could provide tools for interacting with the psychedelic experience in everyday life. How do
Hmm.
you recognize what you're seeing? What kind of questions do you ask? How do you proceed getting the most out of the experience that you can? What do you do if you're afraid? All kinds of practical issues, as well as the more theoretical ones.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. You covered literally answered about 5 or 6 questions I was going to ask you. You covered in that summary, so I can skip past those. That's great. And you also, I mean, didn't mention the summary, but you also wrote or co-wrote the psychedelic handbook as well, which I have here, which also goes through very practical, um, advice for the psychedelics, which is wonderful too. I wanted to ask you, and you do provide, I mean, many examples in the book that compare the DMT experience to the prophecies in the Old Testament. Can you provide what do you think is maybe the strongest link or the best supporting evidence of a link between DMT and the prophetic accounts in the Hebrew Bible?
Well, if you read the first few verses of chapter 1 of Ezekiel, it's
Mm,
completely a DMT experience.
mm,
He's standing by a river. I mean, and he- um, and he hears a roaring sound, which is what happens when you begin
mm,
experiencing a big effect of DMT. He falls down, and the heavens open, and there's angels, there's uh, spinning wheels, there's lightning, there's ice that's blue, there's copper colored flashes of light. The angels have got wings, and uh, the angels' wings are covered with eyes. He's terrified. The angel picks him up and pulls him heavenward. So it's fairly much. I would not have been surprised to have heard one of my volunteers describe that, uh, word for word.
sure, yeah. And reading the accounts in, I have the Spirit Molecule here as well, which is a wonderful book. I read this a few years ago. Highly recommend all these books, and I'll link below in the description for the audience participants to check those out and buy those online. The the spread of beings and entities that are mentioned in the DMT experiences are just, I mean, all over the map. In terms of it, it does seem that there are some linkages, I guess, or some patterns you could probably find. How closely do the entities in the DMT experience match with the beings in the Hebrew scripture?
Most of the time in scripture, the angels, which are the most common beings,
Mm,
usually have got, human-like features.
mm,
And, sometimes if you're not a skilled prophet, for example, Samson's father,
mm,
um, who mistakes, the angel, who announces, Samson's birth, for a person. He asks the angel if he wants to eat, like, are you hungry? Uh, and Abraham encounters, uh, 3 angels as well, early on in his mission, and he offers them food as well. And the angels, theoretically, pretend to eat. That's the explanation. So oftentimes they look human. They're
mm,
mistaken for human,
mm.
especially if someone's prophetic powers aren't especially well developed at the time. Um, Ezekiel among the prophets is, one of the most, psychedelic. Daniel um, also has a lot of visions. There's these beasts, goats and sheep and whatnot, big statues, huge, humanoid, kinds of creatures. In the DMT experience, they're pretty varied as well. Like I mentioned earlier, they could be insects, they can be plants, they can be humanoid, even sentient furniture, things like that as well. One one point I make in DMT and the soul of a prophecy is the notion of um, content equivalence. In other words, you, the visions, or the content of the visions assumes or is displayed in a form that is familiar to the person.
Mm,
For example, Ezekiel would never see a car, um,
right.
and one of my volunteers would never see, for example, I don't know, something which they had never seen before. So the mind or the brain, or God, as it were, will present the material of interest in a form which is perceptible to
Right.
the person experiencing it, in order to convey certain information.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating. Um, what's been the response like to the book? I mean, I believe it's in 2014 was published, like September
2014, yes.
2014. Yeah, so it's been 10 years. What's been the feedback?
um it's interesting. It does fairly well on Amazon. It's usually runs at like their ranking of around 500,000 or so, 250 to 500,000, as compared to the spirit molecule, which is always under 100,000 in ranking, and
Mm,
sometimes even now is 15, 16,000.
mm,
Um, it was a muted response, I'd say. It continues to sell. Um, but I think it was a little bit far afield for psychonauts.
mm,
Most people interested in psychedelics are not interested in the Hebrew Bible or in traditional Western religions. They're more interested in Eastern religions, New Age,
sure.
approaches, paganism,
Mm,
nature-based religions.
mm,
Um, the Muslims were interested early on, the Christians as well. It took a lot longer for the Jews out there to pick up on the book and the material in it. A lot of people want to hone in on, oh, does that mean that the prophets were taking mushrooms, or tripping, or what was in the incense or the burning bush, those kinds of things.
mm,
So it becomes it almost becomes a search for outside psychedelic agents, but that's not the point at all. The point is the brain makes DMT, and that's all you really need to know,
right.
and dispense with, is it a mushroom, is it a mold, is it acacia, or whatever. um, and Even then, the more important element, I think, is what is the content of the prophetic message. And for most psychedelic types, they adduce or subscribe to a universalistic religion. Like all is one, all
Mm,
paths lead. Like all paths lead to the same God. Those kinds of things, which is not the Jewish message at all. That is not the message of the Hebrew Bible. The ideas contained in the Hebrew Bible, for a lot of secular psychedelic users, are anathema. There's one God, there's reward and punishment, there's the chosen people, there's the promised land. All that stuff really stirs people up,
sure.
and they would rather just not deal with it and just switch over to this universalistic religion.
Yeah, that's interesting. And given the amount of time, I mean, if you were to say update the book today or re-release it today, what would you make any changes to it? How would you revise, or what's perhaps changed in your thinking since you came out with the book?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hold on.
Oh, sure.
Well, I continue your scribbling notes in my books to kind of in the spirit of updating. Mostly what I have done, or the scribbles, um, just are more examples of the overlap between the two states, the prophetic state and the DMT state, um,
Mm,
and also explicating or unpacking the message. For example, people complain that the God of the Hebrew Bible is only punishing. But I've got a verse here from Micah and Hosea describing a loving God. And mechanism wise, if one believes in a divine mechanism, in other words, God uses the brain to communicate with us, that can be unpacked. And I've got a quote from Isaiah here about God allowing prophecy to occur. So I would just expand some of the specific the specific ideas. um, you know, I present this concept of theoneurology in the book to you provide an alternative view to how spiritual experiences take place compared to the reigning theory, which is neurotheology. So
mhm,
neurotheology proposes that the brain responds to any number of stimuli with an experience or with a biological effect, which is experienced subjectively as a spiritual experience. There's voices and there's visions and there's ecstasy and things, and it's a brain reflex which is adaptive. For example, you might be more compassionate or more creative, and that's why nature designed things that way.
right.
um, that's what I call a bottom-up approach. The top-down approach is a more spiritually oriented one, which proposes that the brain was designed by God to allow divine communication, and as opposed to the bottom-up approach, which would suggest that it feels as if you're experiencing divine communication. Theoneurology, the top-down model, uh, more proposes that the brain is designed to communicate with spiritual levels of reality.
That's fascinating. Yeah, a lot of questions to ask you about the differences between neurotheology and theoneurology. I know we're coming up on time here. I want to be careful. I just want to be cognizant of your schedule. The couple things, I guess, perhaps teaser for next time or a second conversation we could have, because I definitely wanted to dive more into the differences between the mystical-unitive and interactive-relational experiences that are core to this book. But also perhaps one last kind of question. I was surprised that specifically because of its usage in ayahuasca, where DMT is the active ingredient. I'm surprised that the shamanic tradition, takes a back seat along with Buddhism, sort of in the framing here, or at least in the take of where you say the Hebrew Bible is a much better model for understanding the experience. And I think you've alluded to perhaps some like drawbacks or ethical issues with the like South American shamanism. Could you comment on that in any way?
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
and I could also respond, to your first comment too about the difference between, the
Hmm.
interactive relational and the unitive mystical. The unitive mystical is, the mystical experience, the
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist Kensho or enlightenment. There's no, there's no time, no space, no individual self. Um, the problem with putting that on a pedestal and having that as the default state is that because it has no content inherently other than, oh wow, this is amazing. What does it mean? And I think it is liable to be interpreted however you want it to be,
Mm-hmm.
either by those who are giving you the drugs or you after you've come down. You could say, oh, that means, or oh, that must relate to, so I think you're a little more on your own or at the the mercy of other people that interpret formless uh, state. Um, and you can't do much with it either. What does it mean? You can write it down, but there's not much to say other than the feeling and the certainty that something monumental happened. But what exactly is that? Um, so in the interactive relational state, which the paradigmatic spiritual interactive relational state is, prophecy. That is what most people experience most of the time when they trip. There's stuff going on. There's
Mm-hmm.
information that they have to absorb, remember, write down, or talk about afterwards. So I think it's more of a practical platform to work with. And if you put as much emphasis on the interactive relational state, uh, the prophetic state, there's a huge literature on the prophetic experience. The Hebrew Bible is a prophetic text. So you could open up the text and you can get answers to things that you might not be, so sure about. For example, the Golden Rule. Um, um, it's commonly assumed to mean, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. That's not the golden rule in the Hebrew Bible. The golden rule in the Hebrew Bible is love your fellow as yourself, and that's very different. So if you want to figure out what your experience just meant, there are textbooks and manuals out there that you can refer to that have been developed over thousands of years by very bright people, very pious, very kind, very generous, very wise. Obviously the Hebrew Bible's been abused, but that doesn't mean you just shun it. It's the most popular book in the world. So there is something there, and I think
Sure.
ignoring it isn't a good idea.
Mm.
Number one, because there's a lot of important information there, and number
Sure.
two, it is being abused, and you want to correct people that are abusing it for nefarious purposes. Um, and your other question was, I'm sorry.
Oh, I guess the perhaps with the shamanic tradition in the Americas, primarily South America, I was wondering if there are any drawbacks or ethical issues with how that's used there.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to go very far.
Mm.
You can just Google shamanic sexual abuse, and there's a lot of stuff that comes up. I think it's just, well, it's kind of like what happened with the early Zen and Tibetan Buddhist teachers that came over to the U.S. and Western Europe, is they were just kind of made into gods, and it
Sure.
just went to their heads. Even the
Mm.
Zen types and the Tibetan lamas, they just were amazed at how they were adored,
Mm.
and they just took advantage of that for sexual favors, monetary favors, power tripping, all those kinds of things. Yeah, and that hasn't really yeah, that has been a problem with the ayahuasca culture. It's becoming more well known, and there's
Mm,
more guardrails in place. But still, there's self-proclaimed shamans who are doing the same kind of thing even without any good training in ethical values. Um, that's another reason why the Hebrew Bible is a useful alternative. It is full of ethical teachings. You know, uh, don't take revenge. Love your fellow as yourself. Don't move boundary lines of your neighbor's property. If you lend money, don't charge interest. Very black and white, meat and potatoes, kinds of ideas. And if you find a teacher who is not doing those things, they steal, they lie, they cheat, they seduce, they are alcoholics, then that, well, maybe that's not a teacher or a teaching for me.
sure. Yeah, understand. I just want to be mindful. Do you have time for a couple more questions, or do you feel like you want to wrap
Sure.
up?
Yeah, maybe
Oh,
one or
okay.
two. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll have to break it down here because there's so many things that would be interesting to ask you about. But well, this is something from the book where you talk about when you were practicing in Zen, and well, I mean, I could just possibly like read an excerpt from the book here. So you routinely pray to the Buddha, Bodhisattvas, and deceased teachers within the lineage. But after some years, the notion was pressed on you that if you're going to bow or pray to something or someone, you want it to be the highest or most sublime thing, right? And I was just wondering, have you? I can understand why. I can understand that sort of that, that leaning. But do you know why you yourself have this sort of preference to go straight to the source?
Well, I think it's my Jewish genes. I
Mm,
think they were just, kind of resisting all the bowing to the statues and the photographs and to each other.
mm, mm,
Yeah, like I was raised Jewish. I went to Hebrew school, 6 hours
mm-hmm,
per week for 8 years. I was bar mitzvah.
mm-hmm,
Went to a camp that we only spoke Hebrew in, and we prayed and wrapped a tefillin on our arms and whatnot, every morning.
right.
Yeah, and then I just dropped it. I became interested in girls and sports and whatever, and then
Yeah, yeah,
started
sure.
taking psychedelics, then discovered Buddhism, and
Mm,
yeah, so as I was maturing, uh, as I was becoming more of a spiritual adult, I started to kind of chafe at the bowing.
mm,
And there's a lot of Buddhist teachers who were born and raised Jewish, and they find that it's compatible one with the other. But that that wasn't the case for me. I thought, well, if I'm going to be bowing to this big old gold Buddha, it's just a statue, you know,
mm,
um, and it could break. Yeah, so um,
right.
and also I was starting to chafe against the hierarchy, the
Mm,
different colored monks and what you had to call them, and all that. It wasn't quite as freewheeling as it had been early on in my 20s when I first started studying with them. So there were a number of things that were kind of pulling me away from the tradition, and at the same
mm.
time, um, you know, I was seeking other things as well.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I think I told you last week when we chatted briefly. I've been studying the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I've been charting it out and trying to map out this Bardo space, and it very quickly starts to look like an org chart, like a big corporate kind of like this person reports to this person, and this you have this spirit that's a, and but it's. I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I mean, I know the saints and like all the hierarchies that are prevalent in that, and all these sort of intermediaries that you can pray to or through to get to God. Which I think is funny because yeah, some people really respond well to that, and others, I don't want a middleman. I just want to bring me straight to the source.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
And one of the complaints that has been raised against Hasidic, Judaism, is they're you're kind of worshiping the teacher as
Hmm.
opposed to God, and it's the same kind of thing. Like the teacher can present your prayers to God, better than you can. But that's a relatively late development, 1700s in Eastern Europe. What's even more troubling is the worship of a
Hmm.
state of
Hmm.
consciousness.
Hmm.
It's almost like statolatry or something like that. Like the emphasis on the mystical experience in current research, current media, current public discourse. It's as if you're worshiping a state, and if you attain that state, then everything will be then everything will be fine. Your depression will go away. You'll be more open. You'll be a better person. Those kinds of things. But that's even a bit more primitive, I would say, than worshiping saints or your teacher. Because the state itself. I mean, what's the state? Yeah, and at least
Hmm.
with a person or a teacher, you've got some feedback. Uh,
Yeah.
but when you're working with the Most High, you've got the prophetic texts, which are a download from the Most High.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I went to a center in New York City here a few months ago,
Oh,
and just
which
to
one?
try it out. Ooh, I can't remember which one it was. It was like 16th and 6th, somewhere around there. So like south of Flatiron, yeah, that kind of area. I can't remember which one. I wish I had that accessible, but I enjoyed it. I mean, they were very welcoming, and it was an interesting experience. But I did ask one of the teachers there because I my pathway into that has been Alan Watts, who
Hmm.
I'm not sure you're probably familiar with, or you probably have read or heard of. And when I asked the
Some.
teacher about it, he said that Watts was so far off from Zen that he was like not a great ambassador for what Zen truly is. So I thought that was interesting because that's like the thing that got me into it. But
Yeah, yeah, that's consensus, I think,
mm-hmm.
about Alan Watts. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, how did I get into Zen? Well, I started, studying Indian Buddhism as an undergraduate at Stanford. It was one of the earliest
Mm-hmm.
undergraduate courses in the country. Yeah, and it was about Indian Buddhism, Theravada,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism, like the original Buddhism.
Yep.
Um, yeah, and it was a little bit Baroque. And there weren't any good, Theravada, teachers around at the time. Yeah, so I, veered into, Sasaki Roshi's, Zen Mind, Suzuki Roshi's, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, um, and DT Suzuki's, books on Japanese Zen, and I was impressed. And when time came to find a teacher and organization, I started off looking at Zen, and after a couple of tries, found a good group.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And before I let you go, I want to ask you about you knew Terrence McKenna back in the day, and I believe he even provided suggestions for your DMT study. I think I may have heard that, but is that correct? Or,
Yeah,
yeah.
well,
Yeah.
yeah. I met Terrence in '86, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he gave me my first DMT experience about a year later.
Wow.
Um,
Wow. That's incredible to get it from
yeah,
him.
that was
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then when it came time to start designing the DMT study, we spent a day together and
Yeah.
came up with the outline of the project.
That's amazing. Have you ever heard of the anecdote he tells about giving a Tibetan Llama DMT?
I don't think so.
That story? Yeah, I don't know how apocryphal it is. I mean, how accurate or true you knew Terrence personally, so he was a storyteller for sure. But he
Uh-huh.
said that he gave it to a very open-minded Tibetan Lama, and I believe his response was that it was the lesser lights of the bardo. That's what he
Oh,
said. That you couldn't go farther into the bardo and return. That DMT took you as far as you could go. Um, Yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember that story. Well,
Mm,
that's interesting, because levels of DMT increase in the dying brain in
hmm
experimental animals.
mm,
So it could be the last thing that we see before we die is the result of elevated DMT in the visual cortex. So there is some truth in the Llama's statement. This is as far as you can go before you die.
yeah, that's incredible. And what's the status of DMTx? Are you still a part of that project, or?
I consulted early on to both the
Okay.
Boulder group and the London group. Yeah, it's a continuous infusion of DMT.
Mm,
Uh, the London group, I think, is 30 minutes. And there's a Swiss group that's been doing it for 90 minutes. And I'm not sure how long the Boulder group is, keeping people in that state. Um, the Boulder group hasn't published yet. The London and Swiss groups, um, you know, the, uh, they have both published in
mm.
the scientific literature. Yeah, and you can keep people in that state for as long as you maintain the levels in the blood and presumably the brain.
That is so exciting. I can't wait to see the future of that research. All right. Could you walk us through what would be a most, I know this might be difficult, but what would be a most average DMT experience? I know that they're so incredible. They can be uh, quite different from one another, but what are the patterns that you found have been most common across DMT trip experiences?
Yeah. Well, I think I would, call them typical, rather than average. I mean, DMT
Mm,
experiences are anything but average. But
mm,
if you're looking for some, common denominators anyway,
mm,
well, it depends on the dose, but most people are interested in hearing about and having experiences on big doses. Um, So in our study, we gave the drug intravenously. We infused it over 30 seconds and then flushed the line with sterile salt water for another 15 seconds. So from the beginning of the infusion till the very end was around 45 seconds. Um, and before the infusion itself was done, maybe at the 15 to 20-second point, people started to feel a rush in an inner feeling of acceleration and tension. Um, Sometimes you would feel the drug going in cool or burning, or not at all. It would depend on the concentration of the drug as well in the solution, or somebody's sensitivity to it. Um, Along with the rush was a high pitched sound. Um, Sometimes crinking, crinkling kinds of, saran wrap sort of sounds, but usually, just a high pitched, sound, like tinnitus in a way, like, ringing in the ears, but
mm,
it would start and then build and build and build and build.
mm,
At, with, the end of, the rush and the end of the sound, uh, people would lose awareness of their body. Um, we would check, blood pressure at the 2 minute point after the infusion was done, at the 5 minute point, the 10 minute point, 15 and 30. The 2 minute point, nobody really felt the blood pressure cuff inflating, and it's one of those mechanical cuffs, so it's
mm.
really a strong grip. And most people wouldn't even feel the one at 5 minutes, but routinely nobody felt the one at the 2 minute point. So there's a loss of body awareness and entrance into this world of light, intensely saturated, deep colors, um, all kinds of kaleidoscopic imagery,
Mm.
moving rapidly, morphing, buzzing. Um, Early on in the studies, we didn't routinely put eye shades on folks, but because of the overlap or the overlaying of the visual effects on the hospital room, that was a bit disorienting. So after maybe half a dozen sessions, we asked everyone to put on eye shades before the drug went in. Um, so you're in this world of light, and it feels populated or inhabited or full of something, uh, and uh, I guess the best way to describe what people described the state as being full of was information.
Mhm.
And it was a bit vague or hard to pinpoint what the information concerned, but it was information. It was,
Mhm.
uh, pregnant with information, full of information. Um,
Mhm.
one's, personality was maintained, one's, sense of self, in pretty much every case. In other words, you could interact with the contents of the vision. If there were beings in that state, which could take any shape or form, you can interact with them willfully, respond, ask questions, give answers, those kinds of things. Um, it was quiet, generally. Quiet, like after a bell has rung, like a huge bell, a church bell, like gong,
Mhm.
and the sound goes away, but there's still this echoing within the silence, even though there's no sound anymore.
Mhm.
It's this sense of auditory fullness without any specific kind of sound, at least usually.
Yeah.
The content, well, it was like going to the same foreign country, for everyone, but the specifics within that foreign country were unique to the individual. So, some people saw this, some people saw that, some people saw other things. There might be some healing, there might be some frightening content, there
Mhm.
might be some information about the future or the past, personal things. Usually, the content was personal, rather than, cosmic. There might be some, cosmic insights, but,
Okay.
generally those weren't as, striking as the, personally relevant information that, people tapped into. Um, so the peak effect would be at between 2 and 5 minutes, and you would get yourself oriented, uh, and then kind of cruise in that state for maybe 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes at most, and then you start coming down. Um, even though it was so brief, it was a bit of a paradox. It was super brief in real time, but at the same time, people felt like it was a huge amount of experience compressed into a short amount of time, like a half hour or an hour or 3 hours or
Mhm.
5 hours. But it was only in uh, in real time only maybe 5 or 10 minutes.
Wow. It's remarkable. And I was going to ask you too about, I probably shouldn't use the word average because I think about the experience as average, but what is the most, let's say, typical interpreting? I know there's many different types, but if there are any commonalities between them or patterns that you found.
With respect to,
Oh, the entities specifically, the beings that are encountered.
oh, well, the beings, yeah. I'd say at least, half of the group, I've encountered, visually discernible beings. Um, and even if there weren't visually discernible beings, oftentimes there would be a sense of intelligence with which the volunteer interacted. The form, varied all over the map. Robot, android kinds of things, insects,
Mm.
cactuses, reptiles, humans, um, even sentient furniture in like a futuristic apartment. Gods and goddesses, warrior women,
Mm.
DNA, those kinds of things. Uh, Yeah, so those, were the forms that the entities or the beings took. Um, they were sentient. In other words, they thought, they had intelligence, and they were aware of you, generally,
Yeah.
and they interacted with you. They were
Mm.
powerful too. You didn't really want to dink around. You were kind of in awe, reverence, like these are the real thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you watched your step, generally. Um, they were, conveying information, like I said, mostly personal,
Mm.
or, personally related. Um, uh, there might be some healing. There might be some, frightening content. Um,
Yeah.
there was one gal in this study that had been molested by her stepfather for years and years, and had like chronic low grade abdominal pain. And during her experience, there were this multitude of fluttering hands which were massaging her abdomen, and she came out of this state feeling like her abdominal pain had resolved. Um, on the other hand, there was one fellow who was pinned by crocodiles and raped by them, anally raped by
Mm.
them. So like I said, you really needed to mind your p's and q's and stay alert to what might happen.
Mm.
There was no guarantee it would be a fun, pleasant trip. No,
Sure.
you guarantee it would be a nightmarish trip. So, um,
Mm.
people had the kind of trip that they needed, so to speak, rather than the one that they might have explicitly gone in
Right.
to
Right.
have. At the same time, if you really set your intention, uh, in as ironclad a manner as you could, you might have the experience that you were hoping for. There was a nurse in the study with a long-standing interest in the near-death state, had
Mm.
read a lot of books, had attended workshops and seminars and things, and she had a near-death state, or experience. One of the fellows was a religious studies major in college and was very keen on the Mystical-Unitive white light ego dissolving experience, and he had one of those too. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, there
Yeah. I
wasn't
reckon.
any way to really predict, but
Mm.
uh, you know, they were quite related to the person. That's, I suppose, the
Right.
most telling characteristic.
Yeah. Fascinating. And I remember I was you went on the My Family podcast with Mark Steves Jr., I believe is his name, years ago, I believe, or maybe the last few years. And on the podcast, you actually discussed your first DMT experience, which I believe was with Terrence McKenna, or he helped, or he was with you during that time. And I just thought it was incredible. Would you mind sharing that experience with the audience?
You mean the first time I did DMT?
Yes. Mhm.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. You were kind of breaking up early on there.
Oh, my
Um,
apologies.
yeah, the first time I smoked DMT, it was at a retreat center, and there were a lot of psychedelic literatis and gliteratis. Including Terrence,
Mm.
and this was 1986, I think. Um, yeah, and I was giving and I had just begun my melatonin work in
Mm.
1980, 1985. Um, and ran that study for a couple, 3 years. Didn't really study DMT until, or begin my DMT studies until 1990. So, this was a number of years, before I, gave anyone DMT. Um, so I was giving a talk on the pineal gland and mystical experiences, and endogenous, DMT made in the pineal, those kinds of things. And so Terrence came up to me afterwards and he said, "Well, you're talking about DMT. Would you like to try some?" So I said, "Sure." um, yeah, so like an hour later, we
Mm.
met in a room at the retreat center, and a bunch of my very close friends were there. maybe half a dozen, folks. Um, yeah, and so he instructed me. Well, we were sitting on a bed. He was, sitting on the bed. I was, leaning against, some pillows. And he, and it was like, sprinkled in a joint, like a, marijuana cigarette.
Mm.
And he said, well, take 3 hits if you can. The first, and, hold it as long as you can. The first hit, things will start breaking up. The second hit, things will get pretty weird. If you can take a third hit, do. And he said, at around the 10-minute point, I will say, can you do more? And if you can hear me, and if you want more, sit up, and I'll give you fourth hit. So I took, 3 big hits. Oh, one thing was interesting as well, and this may have been specific to Terrence, is you said, if things get dark and funky, toward the end, open your eyes, sooner than you might otherwise. If things become, sinister and bleak, which you don't, really hear about very much. I mean, I never really saw it in my studies, to be honest.
Sure.
So it may have been specific, to Terrence, his experiences on his own or with other people. So I took, 3 big hits and I lay back. And it was very, it was very strange. Like, it's still rather, fresh in my mind.
Wow.
I was laying back, and my eyes were closed. It was a dimly lit room in the first place. And I beheld this waterfall of flaming color, like Niagara Falls, but made out of like Candyland kind of colors, but flaming, like really bright. And out of the waterfall emerged about a half a dozen ETs. They were about 4 feet tall, and they looked at me very directly. They must have been maybe, I don't know, 50 yards away. 25, 50 yards away. And they just were repeating telepathically over and over. Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see? And if one could be slack-jawed in that state, I was slack-jawed, completely surprised. So they began to fade, re-entered the waterfall. Things kind of resolved, and there were some images. There were some bleak, dark images of war, battles, almost black and white, kind of off on the horizon. And and I did take a fourth hit. I heard
Wow.
Terrence say, "Can you do another?" And I sat up. So it became kind of dreary toward the end, and I followed Terrence's advice, opened my eyes. And walked down to the hot tubs and started processing. So my melatonin work wasn't really going anywhere after the initial study, and my mentor died Christmas Day, coming back from a jog. So I was kind of aimless with respect to my research work. I wanted to study psychedelics. I was looking at melatonin as perhaps a stepping stone. And after smoking DMT, I just said, I'm going to look at DMT and forget melatonin. So things, really started picking up after that.
And what were your emotions like during the experience? I mean, you've used this and phrase, and a lot of your participants in the studies felt more real than real. Was that similar kind of feeling?
Well, the sense of it being more real than real was more of an intuition or a sense of reality. The feeling, like the emotional state, was one of shock and awe and surprise. It was blissful, but at the same time, bliss doesn't quite capture the sense of being stunned and amazed and just overwhelmed by the intensity of the encounter.
Yeah.
I
Is it
wasn't
compared to?
afraid.
Oh,
I
sorry.
suppose the first
You're
few
going first.
moments I was afraid just because it was so intense. But listen, 86, 87, I had been a pretty hardcore meditator for the intervening 12, 13 years or so, so I could relax into the anxiety and it passed.
Yeah. And did the beings look like you said about 4 foot, 4 foot? Were they like your traditional gray aliens, like kind of stuff you see in popular culture?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's incredible.
W-
Well, how does it
Well,
compare? How does it? Yeah.
I think, people use the raw material that they already
Mm,
possess in their imagination to convey
sure.
information that's contained in that state. So if you think of, reptiles as exotic and kind of dangerous and scary and, sexy and things, if, the
Mm,
information that's being transmitted partakes of that quality, then, reptiles will be the ones to convey it. If
mm,
you're if ET images or ET entity kinds of things, represent, to you personally, strange, unworld, otherworldly, exotic, completely unexpected, kinds of memes, then, they would appear to convey, the information that is contained in that state.
oh yeah, understood. Um, it seems that most users, or at least a large percentage of users on DMT, think that the DMT realm is an independent place, that it objectively exists outside of the experience. Did your trip share in this kind of feeling?
Um, I just don't know.
Hmm.
I wasn't as struck by whether or not it was, independent of me or not at the time. It was just an experience and I was immersed in it. Um, yeah, in the, DMT book, toward the end, I speculate as, to the location of the DMT world. Is it in or is it out or is it some combination? Um, And, to be honest, I don't think that's as important as getting the most out of the experience. What did you learn? And is it testable? And if it is it good or is it bad? Is it helpful for you or not? Is it helpful for the larger community or not? One of the things that's going on with these continuous infusion studies, there's one in England and one in Switzerland now. The English group is, working under, the assumption, or at least, leaning, towards believing that uh, the DMT state is independent of us, and we enter into a freestanding, objective reality that's, parallel to this one, and the beings exist there, and the beings can help us
Hmm.
with our ecological catastrophe hurtling, toward kind of uh, trajectory. And I think that's a little dangerous to dissociate the beings from ourselves. I mean, how do we know that the beings are not simply projections of ourselves? We're just like standing in front of a mirror with a Halloween mask on, and we're talking to the image in the mirror, saying, tell me what to do. So I think
Yeah.
that's a little tricky. Um, and if you do believe in the existence or the freestanding existence of these things, if you believe in angels, you have to believe in demons, and demons are marked or characterized, by lying. And so, are you going, are you going, to believe everything that you hear in that state? So I think it's problematic to assume that these are freestanding realities as much as they're just simply information that was previously invisible. And I think I'm like, as the years go on, I'm more and more convinced that this is information that's just unconscious in
Mm.
the person themselves.
Okay, fascinating. Was it the Swedish study that came to that conclusion? You said there was two. Which one came to the
Yeah, there's
conclusion that
a
these are
Swiss.
freestanding? Yeah,
Well, the British
and how?
study is funded by a billionaire who thinks the beings will help us save the world.
Mm.
And so the people which are recruited, or that are recruited for a study like that, are going to know about the theme or the wish or the hope or the idea or the theoretical backdrop of or theological backdrop, spiritual backdrop of the study. Um, so oftentimes these kinds of things turn out to be self-fulfilling prophecies, especially on psychedelics. You basically see what you're looking for, or you find what you're looking
Right.
for. So if you're being given DMT in a study that's being funded by a billionaire who thinks that beings are going to save the world, it's it isn't surprising that the volunteers are encountering beings that are giving them advice about how to make the world a better place, which may be ideas that have been percolating around in their unconscious in the first place.
Right.
Or they may be from some alternative level of reality, in which case you really need to know your source.
Sure. Absolutely. So I guess your opinion at the moment is or are you familiar with like Carl Jung's collective unconscious? That idea?
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
is it similar to
I've heard
that
of it,
or
but I've
no?
never
Yeah.
looked into it. I
Oh
can't
well.
really say.
Yeah.
I'm not well informed enough, to make an opinion.
Yeah. That sounds similar to, I guess, like what you stated, your opinion about what it's more likely to be, what the realm is more likely to in reality be. Can you share? A few minutes ago, you mentioned the idea that more important than, say, the veridical truth behind what it is are the lessons gleaned from it. Can you share any lessons that you learned either from the trip or any other DMT experiences you had?
Um, well, I mean, I've always been, or since that DMT session, I've been pushed along and pulled along, by that question, now do you see, now do you see? Um, and I suppose the repercussions or the answers or, the answering of that question has kept me kind of restless. I haven't really stuck with one thing for super long. Once I've got the answers that I was looking for, I kind of go on to where those answers, subsequently, lead. Like, what are the questions raised by those answers? So I, finished the DMT study and the spiritual nature of the experience, the information content, where did that, lead me next? And it was not in the direction of more psychopharmacology or, psychotherapy. It was, is there a spiritual tradition which can encompass the phenomenology of the DMT state, plus um, evoke, moral, ethical, theological, psychological, cultural lessons. So that kind of led me, to studying the Hebrew Bible. Um, yeah, so and that led me to to understanding the Hebrew Bible, which is like a lifetime job. Um, Yeah, the melatonin work, too, it was interesting. Like I found out that, melatonin, was not psychedelic. And, I dropped the melatonin work. Um, and I was standing in front of a DMT poster at a meeting that I was attending. And one of my old melatonin colleagues, came up to me and she said, "Aren't you studying melatonin anymore?" And I said, no, I figured out what I wanted to, and I'm off to the next thing. And she said, "Oh, you just used the melatonin work uh, as a springboard
Right.
for something." And I said, "Of course."
Yeah.
Yeah, now do you see? Like, okay, I didn't
Yeah.
see it in the melatonin work, but I wanted to
Mm.
continue, looking at a
Mhm.
biological, basis of altered states.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was with your early work in melatonin and perhaps some overlap here with the DMT kind of space. What do we know about I'm not sure if there even is an overlap between melatonin and say dreams, but can you help us understand what are some of the similarities, if there are any, or just differences perhaps between the dream state and the like the DMT trip experience?
Um, well, one of our volunteers, had his experience, and we were talking about it, and the nurse in the room at the time said, "Oh, that sounds like one of my crazy dreams." And the volunteer said, "No, it's way different than a dream." And he said, there's more, temporal, continuity. It's got a beginning and a middle and an end that you can really track.
Mm.
Um, and the storyline is more coherent, from beginning to end. I think what may be the case, although I haven't made a super precise comparison, is lucid dreaming in the DMT state.
Mm.
David J. Brown wrote a book. I forget what it's called. But it's about lucid dreaming, and he makes a lot of comparisons. Um, uh, Between the DMT state and lucid dreaming. But I'm not an authority on lucid dreaming. It makes a lot of sense that endogenous DMT would be involved in the dream state.
Mm-hmm.
It's out of body, or it's non-physical anyway. Colorful, inhabited, interactive. So there must be some contribution of DMT, to the dream state, and you can formulate some psychopharmacological methods or means by which that occurs. Um, there are um, there there are high concentrations of DMT in the mammalian brain, in the rodent. We know that paper came out 5 years ago. But we still do not know in what states or conditions there's more DMT released or synthesized, or there's less. The obvious place to start looking in a rodent, which would be kind of barbaric, but still it would yield important data, is our levels of DMT in the dreaming rodent brain higher than in the non dreaming rodent brain.
Yeah. I have many more questions I could ask you, but I just want to check in on your energy level. How you feeling, Rick? Do you have a couple more
Yeah, let's do
questions,
maybe
or
5 more minutes, and I think
okay?
then we'll be good.
Great, great. Yeah, I just this actually works out pretty well because these are the last couple of questions in this sort of section of questions I was going to ask you. So still have plenty more for future conversations. The I want to ask about some users report a degree of familiarity with the DMT space. They state that they've been there before, or maybe they have like a long history with some entity that they encounter. Um, how often does this pop up in your studies? And I mean, I don't know if you can speak to any familiarity that you've experienced, perhaps in your own trips.
Well, I think that is part of the DMT state, but it's also reported with other psychedelics. Is the sense of being at home, or familiarity. So that opens up a can of worms because is it because that state is familiar, or is it because there's a part of your brain that regulates the sense of familiarity and is being dinged by DMT and other psychedelics, and I think that relates to the feeling of the state being more real than real. Um, the is it because it's more real than real, or is it because just some part of your brain is lighting up that mediates the sense of reality? Um, it's interesting to speculate on a role, excuse me, on a role for naturally occurring DMT in the brain. Is it regulating our sense of reality? And I think, the two are quite closely linked, familiarity and reality, sense, like, I really feel, grounded and familiar and connected, to this experience. Um, yeah, so that is a hallmark of the state, and, with other psychedelics too.
And, and are you aware of any methods for achieving a DMT-like experience without the use of substances? So, um, yeah, or like any. I have some examples of ones I think you might mention, but if you would share any that spring to mind.
Yeah, well, we don't know what regulates the synthesis, or the synthesis of endogenous DMT. So that needs to be stated up front.
Yeah.
Um, the other point, which makes a lot of sense, is to the extent that non-drug states resemble those brought on by DMT, that naturally occurring DMT is playing a role in those non-drug states. So there's all kinds of technologies or techniques that can produce a DMT-like state. There's breathing exercises, there's drumming, there's sleep deprivation, there's stress, there's dreams, there's meditation, all kinds of things. Yeah, but objectively, we don't really, we can't really measure DMT in the blood very accurately. The most important thing will be to visualize its synthesis in the living human brain. John Dean is doing that at UCSD right now. Looking to develop a means of visualizing using MR spectroscopy, synthesis of DMT in the living brain. Um, you know, it's a very strange thing. There's one person in the world right now who's looking at the synth or the regulation of DMT synthesis. And that's a very strange thing. You look at psilocybin clinical trials. There's 150 trials going on looking at psilocybin for everything under the sun.
Yeah.
Zero indications. So far there are no approved indications. And there's one guy in the world looking at the synthesis of endogenous DMT, which is, I think, a much more existentially uh,
Oh, sure.
remarkable, question. What is endogenous DMT, doing in the mammalian brain?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There's nearly 8 billion people on the planet, and it seems like how many serious researchers are there with studies? I mean, hundreds, maybe dozens. I don't know, thousands. I'm not sure what the number is, but it seems like it doesn't. Do you have an intuition
Thousands.
as to why thousands? Do you have an intuition as to why, for something so incredible, so remarkable, why are so few people looking into this?
Um, I don't know. I don't know. It's not a quick fix. It isn't like you
Yeah.
give psilocybin to eating disordered patients and they stop being eating disordered. That's kind of like, okay, this is a study. endpoint is this, questionnaires and weight and things. Um, yeah, but it's a rabbit hole if you start looking at what is endogenous, DMT. Well, first of all, it's extremely difficult, technically. You just don't give psilocybin and give questionnaires and then follow up once or twice. It's really hardcore. It requires a lot of technology and machinery and thinking and physics and all that. So it could be laziness or expediency. You can do other studies more easily and cheaper. But I think more perhaps theoretically overarching question is where's it going to lead?
Mm.
And I think that may be, why people are a little more gingerly approaching it. Well, like one person out of the world who's looking at endogenous DMT. So, it also, begs, the question of why Michael Pollan, uh, you know, mentions our study in one or two sentences as in his entire book. How to change your mind.
Yeah.
Uh, and and he has no references at all to any of our publications. And I think it's because it didn't fit into the narrative of psychedelics are groovy. They'll give you spiritual experiences and they'll help cure illnesses. On the contrary, our DMT study demonstrated if you don't coach people, if you don't prime them to have a particular kind of experience, the experiences are all over the map. And what is DMT doing in the human brain? So
Yeah.
the questions that both exogenous, like outside administered, DMT and naturally, synthesized, DMT raise are, not easily answered.
Right. If I recall correctly, I think that in Michael Pollan's book, I don't believe he did N N-Dimethyltryptamine. I think he did 5-MeO. And he didn't,
I
I
think
believe he
that's
didn't
all
have,
he.
yeah, and I don't think he had a great experience on 5-MeO. I believe he said that, so I'm not doing that one again. Yeah, which is pretty common.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a common refrain after smoking,
yeah.
5-methoxy. Also, salvinorin A, that's a common refrain. I'm not doing that again. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You had a great story about the very tall man, the giant. That-
A very tall
Right?
guy appeared
Yeah.
in a hole in my ceiling. Well, this is another house, but still, it does
Yeah.
not take too much effort.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was 40 feet tall, brown bowler cap, brown suit, and I'm laying on the bed, and my arm starts to dissolve and flow into his pant leg. And he said to me, "It's time to go now." And I was about to be absorbed into this guy's pant leg. And man, I resisted with every ounce of strength I had. Yeah, and I said, "I'm." Well, once I came down, I said, "I'm not doing. I'm not doing that again." Yeah, that experience actually, kind of, showed me I was, mucking around in an area that I may not be the best, qualified or suited to do. Um, this is way bigger than me in a clinical research, study. I need to reassess, what exactly are my motives and, my, my protocols.
Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder, when did that take place with your meditation? Because you mentioned before with the DMT, you were quite able to have the experience, and perhaps your meditation practice helped you remain calm and um, kind of
Uh-huh.
accept what was happening. But the difference with this one with Salvia, it seems like you're holding on to your ego more,
Well, yeah, I was
or
holding
yeah.
on,
Yeah.
to my, to myself, to my body. Actually, I didn't want my
Mm,
body to be absorbed into this guy's brown pant leg, because I
mm,
figured it's all over after that. Yeah.
mm.
Well, I did, try to visualize a protective Buddha. I had enough wits about me that I, could do that, and I, visualized one in the upper left-hand corner, uh, and you know, it was kind of useless.
Oh no.
That
That's
was
rough to
before
hear. Yeah.
I. Yeah, that was before I had begun studying the Hebrew Bible and studying Judaism, and learning prayer. So a number of years after that, I was drinking some ayahuasca with a friend, and I was laying on my bed, and found myself at the bottom of a grave, um, and these vines were beginning to grow over the top of uh, um, on the top of the hole, and I kind of instinctively visualized a Buddha who was not all that helpful, and the vines continued to grow, and it was getting darker and darker. Yeah, and I thought, oh, I know how to pray now. So I started praying, and the vines pulled back, and the light reappeared, and I got up and out of bed.
Oh my goodness. Can you share with us what was the prayer?
Yeah, it's Jeremiah 17:14. Uh,
We'll look that up.
Heal me, O Lord, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are my praise. So I ask for salvation and for healing, for saving and for healing. Yeah, and that is a really great prayer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. And I know we're way over time. I just have one more question because I have a friend that's going to kill me if I don't ask you this, because he just became a Freemason, and my buddy, and I believe I'm pretty sure one of your interviews you mentioned that Masons were the first funders of your research.
Yeah, well, the Scottish Rite Foundation for Schizophrenia Research is a branch of the Masons. The Masons are
Oh, yeah.
philanthropic, and yeah, like the Shriners, hospital and all that. That's branch of the Masons. Yeah, so um, uh, they have a schizophrenia research foundation. Yeah, and
Mm,
one of the interests, or one of the questions that arose during the first wave of studies of DMT in the 50s and the 60s, was whether it played a role in schizophrenia. Like, do schizophrenics produce more DMT than
sure, yeah.
than non-schizophrenics? So
Mm,
uh, I uh, I unearthed that argument and that research in putting a grant together, which was funded by that schizophrenia research group. Um, one of my mentors was on their scientific advisory panel, and we were talking one day, and he said, they might be interested in a DMT psychosis study, and you should apply. Yeah, and I got funding. It was $25,000 for the first year, or for 1 year. And with respect to the strategy of requesting funding, the first from the Scottish Rite Foundation, and the next several from NIH, was, this is going to take a long time to do, and my first year or two of funding, I'm not going to be doing any research. I'm just going to be finding the DMT and dealing with all of the bureaucratic obstacles in the way of performing a study. And that was the case. It took 2 years to get uh, the study off the ground, and I had funding for those two preparatory years.
gotcha. Well, so thank God you got it, or else we wouldn't have the this wonderful research.
Well,
That
it
we're
was just
doing.
one of those things. I was prepared, and the opportunity presented
Mm.
itself, and I just figured, well, it's now or never.
All right. So for the audience, noticing that you have a new background, full disclosure, we recorded these interviews over 3 different days, several weeks apart, and you have since moved to new locations. So that's why you're in a new spot. I'm still wearing the same blue shirt, but you switched up yours.
Right, right. I couldn't remember what shirt I was wearing, and
Yeah.
I only have a handful of shirts, so I just picked the cool summer one.
Same here. Yeah, that's a good shirt too. And but you have the new background, so the illusion is lost if the background is different, which is no
Right.
problem at all.
Yeah, I've got the same UFO lamp behind me, though, it looks like.
Oh
So,
yeah. Yeah, nice. Yeah, you got to have that. So I'd love to kick us off on this last part of our discussion here around the biology. So how DMT impacts the brain specifically, and I'd love to know too, say evolutionarily, how far back do we know or do we think endogenous DMT production goes back? So we know that it exists within mammals. I'm not sure, the exact dispersion of which mammalian types, but can you give us a sense of how far back it seems DMT production seems to go?
yeah, I just don't know, to
Hmm.
be honest. Dennis McKenna might have some more
Hmm.
cogent information. Bromo DMT occurs in sponges,
Hmm.
mammalian, I don't, marine sponges. So that goes, pretty far back.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and I don't know if you could, debrominate DMT or, bromo DMT, if you could remove the bromine by swallowing or smoking or, whatever,
Hmm.
um, the material found in a sponge. So it is ancient, at least, congeners or, uh, you know, um, molecules that contain DMT as the backbone uh,
Hmm.
extend back, pretty far. Um, Biologically, the only real hardcore objective data we've got right now is in the rodent, as far as DMT being made endogenously in the brain, um, and concentrations are quite high, comparable to serotonin or dopamine. So may may turn out that DMT is a neurotransmitter, which obviously would beg the question, what is the function of DMT as a neurotransmitter? Um, its pharmacology is fairly similar to the other classic hallucinogens or psychedelics, stimulating the serotonin 2A subtype, somewhat less the 2C, the 1A as well. 5-methoxy DMT is also endogenous, but hasn't been looked at as carefully in terms of its own production in the brain or in the body, and that has more serotonin 1A properties compared to DMT itself.
Oh, wow. Thanks for that. I actually did not know. Well, one about the sponges. That's the first I've ever heard that there's some form of DMT that sponges produce. And also didn't know that 5-MeO was endogenously produced in the body also. Yeah.
Well, if you look at the older literature, it was, found in brain, urine, spinal fluid, and blood.
Hmm.
But, back in the day, you really didn't know about the accuracy of, the measurement techniques. So the attention, paid to endogenous DMT has been much greater than, 5-methoxy,
Right.
DMT as an endogenous compound. Um, there is a lot of interest in 5-methoxy DMT as a psychotherapeutic aid. So I wouldn't be
Sure.
surprised if attention turns to its natural production more in the upcoming years.
Gotcha. Yeah, fascinating. I'd love to know, this is sort of a broad question, but what do we currently know about DMT's effects on the brain?
Well, the pharmacology is as I described.
Hmm.
So you would expect brain changes to occur in areas where those receptors are in high density or quite apparent or common. They exist there. So It's pretty typical of other psychedelics. There's increased functional connectivity between parts of the brains
Mm.
that parts of the brain that do not normally communicate with each other. So and there's loosening of connectivity within what's called the default mode network, which is
Mhm.
a collection of brain centers, which seem to constitute the sense of self. So in a way, it's confirmation of the subjective experience of a psychedelic.
Mm.
Your sense of self, kind of becomes more porous, isn't quite as rigid,
Mm.
and information, comes up, from so-called lower centers, like emotion, um, perceptual information, memories and whatnot, which the default mode network may normally suppress, but with the loosening of its boundaries, so to speak, information from below, things you've forgotten or repressed or whatnot, uh,
Mm.
are more easily available to the sense of self, which is confirmation of what we all experience if we look carefully enough at what's going on
Mm.
when we take a psychedelic.
Interesting. Yeah, I was looking at it was Dr. Timmerman's work
Hmm.
on brainwaves. Human subjects after taking DMT, they noticed that there was, let's see, the brain was able to enter into different wave states in different regions. So there were both an increase in the low frequency delta waves and also in the high frequency gamma waves in the frontal and occipital regions, which I heard likened to responsible for rational thinking and visual processing. Do you know anything about sort of different waves, um, sort of wave states being generated by the brain on DMT?
No,
Oh yeah,
not really.
it's a tough one. Yeah.
It's very specialized stuff. Like even
Mm.
as a medical student, when I took
Mm.
neurology, my eyes would just glaze over when they started talking about your brain waves and EEGs back then even. Yeah, so the ability to assess um, the brain waves generated uh, in response to various altered states is beyond me, really. I hate to
Yeah,
say it, but it's
me
true.
too. No, it's okay. Yeah, the I was reading also recently, rereading Dr. Andrew Gallimore's Reality Switch Technologies. Have you? I know you've worked with him before. Have you read that book by any chance? Or
No, it's
oh
the
yeah,
same kind of thing. I just don't get
yeah,
it. So,
yeah.
uh,
It's taken me. Yeah, that's why I say rereading because I think I read through it once and was most of it was way past me, and then going through it again a second time, it's a little bit easier to grok or to kind of at least follow along. And he talks a lot about I think it has something to do with like forward and backward air signaling with regards to DMT. But yeah, I'd have to review that several more times to even get a basic idea of what's happening there. So
well, fundamentally, my training, was as a psychiatrist,
mhm.
as opposed to a neuroscientist.
Right, yeah.
And I've ventured fairly far afield with my interest in neuroendocrinology, which was the biological basis of understanding the DMT effect.
Mhm.
But basic but more to the point is I trade in the currency of subjective experience as opposed to the objective
Mm,
neuroscience.
yeah. And one more thing on the brain, I would say, is the around the pineal gland. So I
Hmm.
know in DMT, the spirit molecule, you put out then, and I think it has been for a long time, been thought that it's related to DMT production. Where are we in terms of where's the state of sort of the pineal gland hypothesis today? Like, how has that
Hmm.
changed over time?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so back in the early '90s, even I published a paper in psychedelic monographs and essays. Very obscure psychedelic rag, which I think 5 issues came out. Yeah, and I garner or I muster a huge amount of scientific circumstantial data, supporting a potential role of the pineal in producing DMT. The precursors are there.
Mm,
The enzymes, to convert the precursors into DMT are there. Um, there's a protective layer around the pineal, which would support the notion that you really need to stress the organism for the pineal to produce DMT if indeed it did.
mm,
So it was a fairly strong circumstantial case that I made. Jimo Borjigan at the University of Michigan, caught wind of my pineal theory, and she's a long-standing, internationally renowned melatonin and pineal expert.
mm,
So so she and one of her graduate students, John Dean, uh, um, started looking at, is the pineal gland in the rodent making DMT? So there was a 2013 paper, that they published, demonstrating, concentrations of DMT in the fluid around the pineal gland. Um,
mm,
you know, so that supported the notion of the pineal producing DMT. They went back looking at the pineal in their 2019 paper, which convincingly demonstrated brain levels of DMT being quite high. But they weren't able to demonstrate pineal concentrations of DMT itself, and they concluded that their 2013 data, um, the DMT that they measured in that 2013 paper was actually brain DMT, which they snagged along the way of the probe going in and out of the pineal gland.
mm,
Um,
mm.
so if you if you kill an animal in a lab, concentrations of DMT increase in the brain, especially in the visual cortex. So they removed they the pineal glands in those animals and experimentally induced cardiac arrest in intact animals and in animals without pineal glands. And actually, concentrations were even higher after death in the pinealectomized animals.
Wow.
So their data, does not, or
Mm,
their, return, their repeat data, didn't support a role for the pineal gland in making DMT.
mm,
Nevertheless, the precursors there are there in the pineal. The enzymes are there in the
mm,
pineal. So it may be the case that the pineal makes DMT, but not routinely. That there
mm,
may be certain circumstances in which it's called upon, to produce DMT.
mm. Interesting. Okay, so it's still the jury's still out. It seems like we don't know.
With respect to the
Yeah,
pineal gland, the
yeah.
jury is still out. With respect
Mm,
to the brain, though, it's fairly clear cut.
mm,
In humans anyway, humans without pineal glands are relatively normal. They dream. They're just as imaginative as
mm,
normal individuals. You can have cancer of the pineal gland. You can have a stroke of the pineal gland, which
mm,
destroys the tissue. The main thing, and it's been some time since I've returned to the literature, but the main thing I remember is that if you have no pineal gland, it's more difficult, to adjust, to time zone, travels. Your
mm,
experience of jet lag is worse,
mm.
which makes sense with respect to melatonin, which is responsible, for sleep wake, cyclicity.
Gotcha. And how about this is probably more of a field, but cerebrospinal fluid. Is there been any promising research in relation to DMT with that?
Um, well, you can measure DMT in CSF. Um, yeah, but if you really want to measure DMT, you need to go into the brain. Concentrations in the spinal fluid and the blood are just too low to measure accurately
Mm-hmm.
with any confidence. John Dean, who worked in GMO's lab, is at UCSD now as a postdoc and is looking, to image, the synthesis of DMT in living human brain, with MRI spectroscopy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's really tedious, but stay tuned. If he can crack that nut, we'll be able to start looking at the function or the role or the mechanics of DMT in
Mm-hmm.
dreams and in other altered states, psychosis, everyday life, for example, too.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating. And I guess more on this is quite from left field, but I was looking into it, but I couldn't find any um, like supporting evidence or any results from. You're probably familiar with the MKUltra, the
Yeah.
CIA's unethical 1950s to 60s experiments they did on folks with using psychedelics, and I believe DMT is always. I've looked at the list of what psychedelics were tested. DMT is on that list, but I haven't been able to see any, say, results or any kind of output from what they found with DMT.
Yeah, I don't remember any reports of DMT effects in MK Ultra. Back in the day, I downloaded all those MK Ultra files,
Oh
and
wow,
they are really heavily redacted.
redacted.
Some
Yeah.
pages it's just all black magic marker. You can't I mean you can't see anything.
Mm,
Um, in books that I've read about MK Ultra. I don't remember, DMT. Mostly LSD, BZ, which is this anticholinergic, drug like, belladonna or atropine or scopolamine.
mm.
Um, BZ is the, drug that is the culprit in, that movie that, came out a long time ago, Jacob's Ladder, stars Tim
Oh yeah,
Robbins.
I saw that
Yeah.
last month. Yeah, for the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's BZ. It is a true psychotomimetic. You're
yeah.
completely in another world and you have no idea what's going on and you interact with that world and
Mm,
it's
mm.
fairly grim. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I finally watched that movie. I think I've talked to you offline about my interest in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I know that that movie was inspired by or heavily influenced by the book. So, and near death experiences and everything, of course.
Well,
Yeah.
speaking of the Book of the Dead, did you
Hmm.
watch Gaspar Noé's Into the Void?
Oh, Enter the Void.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Actually, that was one thing I wanted to ask you, talk to you about. Yes,
Hmm.
absolutely, I did. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
about the movie? Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty disturbing movie, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, some guy is in a seedy Japanese, nightclub in the
Uh-huh.
bathroom smoking DMT, and he's, shot and killed. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then he just goes, through all these bardos. Um,
Yep.
yeah, it was too much actually. I started to. It was hard to pay attention to the progression. It was just so sordid and
Mm-hmm.
grimy. Yeah, yeah. But you know, uh, it's an interesting film, and there aren't that many movies out there about DMT. So uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good. It's a good example of what can be done with that material.
I agree. That's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and we can talk about it now. If there are any other pieces of media that you know of that do represent DMT or showcase it well. I mean, did you find that the visuals in that movie were decently representative of a DMT trip?
Not so much.
Oh, okay. Hmm.
Yeah. It more seemed like like Bruegel picture
Hmm.
or painting.
Hmm.
Let's see. Sense8
Oh yeah,
is a Wachowski TV series,
Netflix. Yeah, I
um,
remember that.
and the first episode has got a big DMT scenario.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, sense spelled SENS, with an
Yep.
eight, like a numerical eight. Yeah, yeah, there was the Wachowskis did that.
Hmm.
Yeah, and this guy seduces this girl with DMT or whatever, and they do a mind meld sort of thing, and there's this
Hmm.
rap about DMT is released at the time of death, and allows people to communicate with non physical realities. But it
Hmm.
never makes another appearance. Um,
Hmm.
let's see. Are there other movies? There probably are, but um, yeah, I can't think of any offhand.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's rare. That's for sure. Like it's not super common. But you said it was the Enter the Void. The visuals you say like Bruegel, like the Dutch artist,
Yeah,
or oh, okay, interesting. I'm just looking at some of his Bruegel, Peter Bruegel the Elder.
yeah.
So this is, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll take a look at some of his. I've seen some of this artwork before, but that's interesting that connection. You're making that connection with Enter the Void.
Yeah, it's the hell realms, mostly.
Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. I'll have to dive into that a little bit more. So cool. Um, so we touched on that a little bit. I do want to talk about one thing I recall from your the psychedelic handbook, your book. The You talk about how DMT, ketamine, and salvinorme they often lead to encounters with beings, with other entities. Is there something like common across the three of these? Like,
Well,
I mean, besides that point, like anything?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, pharmacologically, they're quite different. DMT is a classic psychedelic. Salvinorin A, is a kappa agonist, and um, ketamine is an NMDA antagonist. So they all are different pharmacologically. It's interesting. When I was writing that book, I was interested in seeing if the specific drugs produced unique brain imaging signatures. But they don't, apparently. They're more alike than different. The
Hmm.
thing which seems to be common among the brain signatures is the altered state itself. So if you're tripping, no matter what the drug is, the profile of what's going on in the brain is more similar than not. So
Hmm.
that's the case with the classic compounds, with ketamine, MDMA, salvia, even THC.
Hmm.
So the subjective experience is what differentiates the different drugs, more than the brain imaging, and that's consistent
Hmm.
with decades of research. Subjective effects are much more sensitive than biological ones. Even questionnaires can be more sensitive than a blanket assessment of subjective experience. Like for example, our questionnaire, the hallucinogen rating scale, was more able to distinguish between placebo and a low dose of DMT than people guessing if they got placebo or a super low dose of DMT. So subjective experience is much more sensitive than biological parameters. But why do those drugs produce entity or being contact? Yeah, well, they just do. Um, yeah, we can't say why they do based on their biology,
Hmm.
because their biology differs. Um, So, or their pharmacology differs. As far as what they're doing biologically, we aren't able to differentiate any differences.
Mm.
Um, yeah, yeah, they just do. But what does that mean? Or what does that mean? And I think at this point, the simplest explanation is the most reasonable one, which is that um, they make visible, more or less, things which are normally invisible
Mm.
in the mind.
Mhm.
So that could be external realities, but it makes more sense, that because the experiences are so unique to that individual, that they are originating in the person's psyche.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I'm just looking through these questions, and I know that we're coming up on time in a few minutes, so I do want to prioritize here. Um, it seems, well, I guess, coming back to, the book that we spoke about several weeks ago, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. So the N N-Dimethyltryptamine experience is rich with information. Um, has there been, and I remember, hearing people's trip reports, and from, like, say, Terrence McKenna saying, oftentimes you're shown these, orbs or Fabergé-like eggs, and the beings are kind of like showing things to you. Like,
Mhm.
that's pretty common. It's like they're trying to. It's like, pay attention, watch this, see how this works, right?
Right.
Have there
Yeah.
been any that you know of, any discoveries or technological innovations that people have taken back from the DMT experience?
What do you mean, like fusion energy, something like that?
Oh, that would be incredible. I mean, yeah, anything. I mean, sure, if that's the case. But I mean, yeah, I guess the things. Yeah, I think the things that they're showing the users are so advanced that it's incomprehensible, perhaps. Which I guess would make you think, why are they even showing us anything if we're not going to be able to take it back or understand? But
Um, well, you need to be, ready to understand what you're being shown,
hmm,
and then to translate it into um, some kind of action, or some kind of insight. And that depends on the person. Like uh, you know um, one example I like to give is Francis Crick, seeing the double helix on LSD. Only Francis Crick could have seen the double helix on LSD. I couldn't
hmm,
have. You couldn't have, like in the 1960s or 1950s. So uh, you need to be prepared. Uh,
hmm,
you need to be in a state of yeah. You need to have done your homework to understand what you're seeing. Um, I think for most people, most psychedelic experiences are solely personal.
hmm,
They're just working on their own stuff.
hmm,
There's no major cosmic truths which are being revealed, or if they are, it's only a feeling. It's a feeling of awe, or wonder, or terror, or love, or ecstasy, or those kinds of things.
hmm,
But the information which is associated, with those feelings, tend to be, rather rudimentary. Like all is one, or God is love, or things like that. Nothing especially earth-shattering. But generally, or more specifically, uh, any information which comes through is related to the person themselves, as opposed to any new spiritual revelation, or technological innovations.
hmm. Gotcha. It's really interesting. Um, as you've mentioned a few times, and as I'm sure many of the viewers and listeners are aware of, there's a lot of promising therapeutic value to psychedelics in general. Could you? I know it's maybe it's a crude way to do it, but if you had to rank, let's say, in top five, like, at this state, for as much as you're aware of, what do seem to be the most promising few, um, like psychedelics for therapeutic purposes?
Boy, you know, I
Tough one.
would have answered that, differently a couple of weeks ago,
Mm,
before the FDA advisory committee just put the kibosh on the MDMA scenario. Are
mm.
you familiar with that?
I'm not. No, please tell me more.
Oh, it was all over
Unfortunately.
everything.
Mm,
Yeah, the FDA, convenes a scientific advisory committee when considering a new drug application or an NDA. And MAPS converted themselves to Lycos pharmaceuticals a year or so ago,
mm,
in order to put into motion their new drug application for MDMA assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. And even though the FDA isn't under obligation to follow the recommendations of their advisory panels, they usually do. And the advisory panel met, I don't know, maybe up to a month ago now, maybe 3 weeks. And they had to vote about the efficacy of the treatment, and the safety. So they voted you know 9-2 against its efficacy, and 10-1 against its safety.
wow.
So the FDA would be hard pressed to ignore that recommendation, to just say back to
Mm,
the drawing board. Um, yeah, so I think, theoretically, or if, in an ideal world, um, I think, classic, psychedelics are the best, bet. Things like LSD, mescaline, DMT,
mm,
ayahuasca, psilocybin, for all manner of, disorders,
sure.
and for, wellness as well. Obviously you have to, think about the dose and the setting and the
Hmm.
condition, that you're working with. Um, like, religious experiences, versus depression treatment, versus, creativity, microdosing, all that. Um, and, what kind of, psychotherapy, if any, who's going to do it, all those things. There's like a lot of moving parts, but I think, from the perspective of, safety, um, that, the classical, or, the classic compounds are your best bet. MDMA, like it or not, is neurotoxic at certain, doses, cumulative exposure.
Right.
Ketamine's addictive. Salvinorin is just way too weird.
Yeah.
Ibogaine is, kind of tricky to use. So I think, the tried and, true compounds are your best bet.
Mm,
Um, but I think, yeah, and you could use small doses, medium, medium doses, high doses once or twice, or over the long haul, um, once a month, once a year, every few weeks, something like that.
yeah.
The details to be worked out.
Hmm.
But I think as a, class of drugs, that's, the class I would, place my bets on. All of the hoopla and the the wind at your sails that everybody was feeling with the MDMA FDA thing, and psilocybin for depression, and everything else. The wind, um, the wind has definitely been taken out of the sails,
Mm,
from all of those. Those indications. I think a lot of it had to do with putting the cart before the horse. There just has not been
sure.
enough data accumulated about what psychedelics are doing, and how they're doing it. People just jumped right onto the therapeutic bandwagon, which I think was a strategic error.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, that's I guess it's unfortunate in some ways, but Yeah, it's it's the reality of what we're living in with the. I didn't know about that change, yeah, with MDMA. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it was a real confrontation with the reality of the
Mm,
establishment.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, and I think the panel was saying slow down here.
mm,
Let's take one thing at a time, and you need to go back to the basics.
right, absolutely. Well, I guess I know you have to run, so one fun question just before we go, and then we'll wrap up. What's your favorite brand of sourdough pretzel?
Uh, my favorite, that's the Steve Colbert, you know, uh, question. Snyder's Snyder's of
Snyder's.
Hanover. Yeah,
There's a
yeah,
Hanover. Yeah, it's a solid one. That's a good one. Oh, I know you
yeah,
like them. You had a Reddit and Ask Me Anything where that came up. So,
yeah. Well, I have crowns in the back of my
uh,
like my back molars,
yeah.
and I had like big problems with one of my crowns, and
Mm,
some years ago that prompted the medical horror story of Joseph Levy escapes death.
oh yeah.
So I don't eat sourdough pretzels anymore, even though I would like to. I'm uh, uh, I'm limiting myself to pretzel sticks nowadays.
Alas, all good things. Well, and
Right.
you mentioned Joseph Levy. I love, as we wrap up here, if you could tell the audience where they can find out more about you and your work, perhaps the latest changes to your website, any books coming
Yeah.
out soon. Yeah.
Right. I have a new book, coming out December 10. It's called My Altered States, and it's an illustrated memoir of my own altered states, which occurred from 0 to 22 years old,
Mm,
and it includes all kinds of precipitants, psychedelics and cannabis and alcohol, depression, meditation, hypomania, like it's a full palette
yeah.
of experiences. Some are tragic, some are pretty hilarious. I mean, it's illustrated, by the woman who did the cover for Joseph Levy. So the illustrations are quite evocative. Yeah, and I am revamping my website rickstrassman.com. It features the new book. You can pre-order it actually,
Hmm.
and I'm going to start blogging a little more too. Some book reviews, things like that. Yeah, it's rickstrassman.com, and yeah, the new book will be coming out. What is this? This is the end of June. So, still like another, 5.5 months or so
Hmm.
from now.
Still always away. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll in the link to in the description of this video, I'll have all links to your website, your social media, your books, so folks can continue to dive in and learn more about you and your work. And I can't wait for folks to see this. I'm going to stitch these few parts together, and I want to say thank you so much. This has been such a rich series of interviews. I've learned so much, and thank you for being so open and sharing, personal experiences and your scientific knowledge. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, great. Well, I've enjoyed our conversations too. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.